From 1977 through 1982, there was a live-action television series called The Incredible Hulk, loosely based on the Marvel comic book character of the same name. When I say loosely, the fact that the Hulk character's secret identity name was David Banner in the show is one of just many examples I'm referring to. A few years after the show ended, some television producers got the idea of making a live-action TV show about Thor. Instead of making a pilot about Thor alone, they got the idea of making a made-for-TV movie about the Hulk meeting and teaming up with Thor, and hopefully passing the torch for Thor to have his own show. This made-for-TV movie was shot and aired May 22nd of 1988, but ended up not being picked up for a Thor TV series. And today, I'm going to give a plot description and then review of this made-for-TV movie. This movie starts off with David in a relationship with a woman named Dr. Maggie Shaw. David is not turned into the Hulk for a few years, and Maggie has no idea he ever was the Hulk. Maggie works at a scientific research center called Joshua Lambert Institute, which is obviously owned by a man named Josh Lambert. But Josh has a younger brother named Zach Lambert who works for him. Zach appears to be very jealous of his older brother's position. At this lab facility, David has built a machine which takes away gamma radiation. David's true goal with this machine is to rid himself of his own gamma radiation, therefore rid him of his Hulk abilities. One night, David is alone in the lab building after hours and on the verge of using the machine to rid his gamma radiation. As this happens, we see a man on the ground outside the building throw a grappling hook up and sneak his way in. This man goes straight to the room David's in and turns off the machine just in time to stop David's attempt. This man is identified as Donald Blake, who is an old college friend of David's. Now, if you've read Thor comics from the 1960s, then you'll recognize the name Donald Blake as the doctor who found Thor's hammer and is able to transform himself into Thor. But here, Donald Blake's story is different. Blake says he's come to his old friend David because something very strange has happened to him, and he's always believed David could somehow have the answers to help him. Blake tells a story that he took part in an amateur hike in snowy mountains to research Viking history. During this hike, Blake felt a sixth sense pulling him to the top of the mountain, and so he continuously hiked alone. At the top of this mountain, he found a cave and entered. Inside, there was all kinds of Viking writing and a coffin. Blake opened the coffin, saw an ancient skeleton with an old hammer. As Blake picked up the hammer, he resurrected an old force, and suddenly, this ancient Viking named Thor was right there in front of him. In this version, Thor was not a god, but an ancient Viking. Blake explains he's been carrying this hammer around with him and regularly using it to temporarily bring Thor into our time before sending him back to his own. David doesn't believe the story. He thinks Blake just had a hallucination while in the high mountains. So Blake gets frustrated and decides the only way to get David to believe him is by calling Thor to appear in front of them. And Blake does just that. Thor starts acting a little arrogant, and David tries to tell him to calm down, and we see that David is holding back from getting angry. Thor gives David a little push, which throws him into a machine that gives him electric shocks. Then Thor pulls David off the machine trying to help him, but this is enough to make David angry, which turns him into the Hulk for the first time in years. Blake is stunned to see his old friend has a secret, and Thor thinks he can handle a fight with the Hulk, and so a fight begins. Damage is done to a lot of machinery in the room. Hulk eventually throws Thor out the window onto a porch. Thor then says he would like to stop fighting and make friends with Hulk, but Hulk just jumps off the building and runs. Blake then uses the hammer to send Thor back to his own time, and Blake runs away without being caught. The next day, David is back in his human form, and Thor finds him and says he would like to make peace, and so they do. After Blake sends Thor back to his own time, David tells Blake he feels Blake is responsible for the damage done to the lab, and Blake should take part in the repair. And so Blake agrees to. Meanwhile, there's another story going on with a group of bad guys who are in touch with Zach Lambert, the younger brother of Josh Lambert, who again is the owner of the scientific research building. These bad guys are interested in stealing the technology that can take away gamma radiation because they think they can use it as a powerful weapon to their advantage. Zach Lambert is aware of their intentions and willing to go along with them for money. Now, in all honesty, I've never found all the details to be entirely clear about how these bad guys intend to use the technology, nor where they get all their money from. One night after the lab has been repaired, David is back in the lab alone after hours, planning to once again try to rid himself of his Hulk abilities. But just before starting the procedure, he looks out the window and sees some people entering the building and feels something is suspicious. These are of course the people on the team planning to steal the technology. So David goes downstairs to confront them, and a fight breaks out during which David turns into the Hulk once again. It's an exciting action scene, but how these bad guys are unable to figure out David is the Hulk is beyond me. We also see Blake take Thor to a bar the same night where he drinks a lot, parties with guys his own size, flirts with girls, and eventually gets into a little fight. The next day, we see David and Maggie talking outside Maggie's beach house, knowing that Blake will be stopping by in a few minutes. Suddenly, the bad guys come overhead in a helicopter with a plan to kidnap both David and Maggie. Once again, I don't fully understand their motives. The bad guys have a tranquilizing gun and shoot Maggie first. David tries to carry her inside the house, but just as he gets close to the door, he gets hit with a dart himself and falls through the window. Blake gets close by and can tell something is happening, so he calls Thor. The bad guys get inside the house and carry Maggie out, but don't see David. Instead, they see the Hulk. How they can't figure out that David and the Hulk are the same person seems like a stretch to me. Thor fights a few people, and Hulk fights a few others. But when they try to get Maggie, she's already been taken inside the helicopter, which has just begun to take off. Hulk and Thor jump up and hang on the helicopter's landing skids in an attempt to outweigh the helicopter with their muscles. This goes on for a little while. Maggie is completely tranquilized, so has no idea of anything going on. Eventually, Thor and Hulk just fall off, and the helicopter flies away. Thor and Hulk are both furious and know they will need to get Maggie back. We then see Zach Lambert meeting with the bad guys, and he's upset they've kidnapped his friend Maggie Shaw. He decides they're not working with him as he planned, and then they show further lack of loyalty towards him. Afterwards, David realizes what a dangerous weapon the technology he's invented can be, and decides it must be destroyed. He says that without one key piece, all the rest of the technology in the room is useless, so he puts that one piece in the microwave and lets it fry. Just afterwards, they receive a phone call from a hospital saying Zach Lambert has been shot, so David rushes to the hospital to visit him. Zach informs David where the bad guys operate from, which is where they're holding Maggie. Zach's brother Josh happens to be there to overhear this. We then see David and Blake hiding outside the bad guys' warehouse with a plan of calling Thor to go in and rescue Maggie. But unexpectedly, they see Josh Lambert driving alone to the warehouse. David knows Josh is likely to go in and try to take revenge for the shooting of his younger brother Zach, so David goes and tries to talk him out of it. This results in a little pushing, which makes David angry, hence the Hulk emerges. Then Hulk and Thor start attacking the bad guys one by one. When the only bad guy left is their leader Jack, he takes Maggie in an alleyway with a gun pointed at her. Hulk just grabs the gun and crushes it. Jack tries to run away, but Thor and Blake trap him in all directions, and Hulk bends a pipe around Jack and leaves him hanging for the police to arrest him. Maggie then looks at the Hulk and is strongly implied that she's now somehow able to tell David is the Hulk. Then Hulk and Thor run away, while Blake stays there with Maggie waiting for the police to arrive. We later see a post-climax scene in which Blake is talking to David, and Blake says their job is done and he's going to leave town and take the hammer with him. Which obviously would have left the door open for a new TV show to start about Blake and Thor, which could have taken place anywhere, though such a TV show never happened. Blake also says that even though David hasn't told Maggie he's the Hulk, he thinks she knows and understands that David can't stay around with his problems. David and Maggie spend one final night together, and then the next morning David leaves walking along the ocean, and that's how it ends. So that's the story. Now, what was my opinion of this movie? Overall, thumbs up. I still like the look of this Hulk better than the modern CGI Hulk. For me, CGI creatures almost never look convincing. But if you just get a huge muscle guy like Lou Ferrigno, put a few prosthetics on his face, give him a wig, and paint his body green, it all looks a lot more believable. I also happen to really like Thor's suit. It does not look like something made in Hollywood. It really looks like something that an ancient warrior would have worn. It looks like something you might find in a museum. Now, you might say that the comic Thor is not a Viking, he's a god, but personally, I watched this movie before I ever read a Thor comic, so this was my first introduction to the character. So what do I think of the story? I've already admitted part of the plot is weak. The bad guy's motives are unclear. I also don't think this movie has any real witty or memorable dialogue. I do like how Donald Blake introduces Thor. I think they've actually improved on the 1960s comics by having Blake call Thor to stand next to him rather than Blake turning into Thor. It opened the door for chemistry between Blake and Thor, but I don't think the writers really did much with that idea here. Nor do I think the writers really did enough with advancing the Hulk story here. It's obvious the writers thought the romance between David and Maggie was something powerful, but I didn't feel a connection to their story, nor did I think the two actors had such special chemistry together. I've talked about my fondness of the look for Hulk and Thor. I'll also say that I really enjoy the action here. When I see the bad guys getting thrown around by Hulk or Thor, it really looks a lot more realistic than modern CGI fights. Also, even just the flashback scenes of Blake in the snowy mountains takes us to a real location and inside a cave. This to me is a lot more realistic than using CGI to create a background when they put actors in front of a green screen. The scene of Blake in the cave is probably my favorite scene in the whole movie. There's really a moment when I can suspend my disbelief and see someone entering a cave and resurrecting a curse to bring back this ancient warrior. I can honestly say I wish modern filmmakers would do more of this and less with the CGI backgrounds. But of course, everything I've said here is just my opinion. I welcome any disagreement and criticism, so please do leave your comments below. I really would like to read them no matter what you have to say. Even if you call me names, I won't take that too seriously. This is all just my opinion of a comic book movie. And I hope you've enjoyed this video regardless of whether you agree with my opinions or not. And I hope you'll hit that subscribe button if you haven't already done so. Before I end this video, I'll mention that in 1989 there was a made-for-TV sequel to this movie called Trial of the Incredible Hulk, in which Hulk teams up with Daredevil. This was the first ever live-action appearance of Daredevil. And if enough viewers leave comments below saying they'd like me to make a video about this sequel, then I will.